Welcome to everybody here today. My name is General John Williams. I was one of the early settlers, but not one of the earliest pioneers to come to Salem. I didn't come to Salem until 1703. I came to this country as a ship's surgeon and bought a parcel of land over in Pollitt, Vermont. And I was over there running my small farm when I heard about a smallpox epidemic in the village of Salem. So I thought I would bring my doctoring services to Salem and try to help people who had smallpox. Smallpox was rampant. And what I discovered when I got here was that the owner of the James Turner, or Turner Tavern, as it was known, and his wife, Susan, were suffering from smallpox. I could not save James. He died from smallpox. A year later, I married his widow. It turned out that actually the tavern was probably one of the wealthiest piece of property in town. The Turners had a tavern in Pelham, Massachusetts also before they moved here, so it's just natural that they would build a tavern for people who needed a place to stay and to imbibe in the evening. Now, shortly after that, as you know, the Revolutionary War broke out. 1775, while I was in Salem, I got a message from General Schuyler asking me to raise a militia in Salem, and he would make me a colonel. He gave me the rank of colonel, and I raised 3 militia groups in Salem. Now, a militia at that time was not a lot of people. The population was not great in the area. If I could get 20 people to form a company, that would be something. If when I needed them I could get 10 people, that would be something. Because remember, these were not soldiers. They were not professional soldiers. They did not belong to the Continental Army. They were farmers. And at any given time of the year, they might be tied up trying to harvest their crops, and therefore they would not turn out in great numbers. However, the group of militia did end up going to Skenesboro, where Colonel Skene had his sort of plantation right on Lake Champlain. And they were going to attack his estate and capture him. So the Salem militia went up, but Skene was not there. But they did find other people there, and so they raided the plantation, and as happens during war, the spoils of war, they brought back with them some of the items from the Skene Manor. Now, they also told a story of finding in the basement of his house a lead casket in which his wife was buried. And the legend is that he did that because in the will of her parents it said all money that would go to her or to Skene would disappear when she died. So he never buried her. But they brought back other items, and in fact they brought back one of Skene's slaves to Salem at that time, a young girl, 7-year-old girl. As far as I know, historical records do not claim that she was brought back as a slave, but lived freely in Salem at that time with Colonel McCracken's family, and was buried in Evergreen, actually buried in Evergreen later, but first initially buried in the Revolutionary War Cemetery. And when this cemetery was built, Dr. Asa Fitch Jr. felt that she deserved a better place than the Revolutionary War Cemetery, so he brought her up here. The sad part is, over the years, we don't know where she is buried. We don't know whether she was buried with another family or whether she had her own stone or not, but that's the tale. Now, as the war went on, of course, I enlisted in the Continental Army and did end up as the surgeon in the Battle of Monmouth. And at the Battle of Monmouth, Colonel McCracken, who was also a Continental soldier, fought in the battle. Now, when he went out to the battlefield one day, he did not return. And my servant and I went out to look for him, and we found Colonel McCracken badly wounded on the field. His right arm had been badly shattered by a cannonball, a small ball, and so we carried him back to our medical tent where I removed the rest of his arm. Now, Colonel McCracken did live. He went on to have a good life in Salem, got into politics, was well known and loved by the people of Salem. So my medical theories and my medical practice came to good here in the community of Salem. Although basically I was known more for my military work and not as a doctor, although I continued to doctor over the years. Now, when the Tories left, their property came up for sale. And my wife and I, the former, Susanna Turner, did have some money, so we ended up buying, very cheaply, lands that were abandoned by the Tories who had left the community. And in the process, we were able to develop those lands and then to sell them for a profit. In fact, I owned most of Whitehall at one time, and other communities around. So the property that I own, some of it we set aside as glebe property. A glebe property is a piece of land, a parcel of land set aside for religious purposes. So we had glebe property in Salem, Presbyterian Church. We had glebe property in Whitehall. And over the years, the Williams family contributed many dollars to raising churches. In fact, they built the Presbyterian Church in Whitehall. The Williams family was here for 4 generations, and we're standing in front of General John Williams's monument. That's my monument. On the hill, where the big cross is, all those bodies were initially buried in the Revolutionary War Cemetery. In the mound on the right, as you went to the cemetery, that was the Williams vault. But John M. Williams later on decided that this cemetery had been built in 1849, and that he wanted to move up here. So the family picked, this is really the highest point in the cemetery. So all the bodies were disinterred from the Revolutionary War Cemetery and brought here. There are 14 stones, 13 around the cross, and the large monument here for General John Williams. The Williams family was very influential over the years. In fact, his presence, he was such a dominating person. It was felt that his spirit was everywhere. And his great-great-granddaughter wrote a book called The Gray Man. She talks about seeing his ghost in the garden out back of the mansion or someplace in one of the rooms in the house. And believe it or not, even in modern times, we still get stories from custodians at school and other people who, in the dark of night, when they're there, say they saw some sort of apparition in one of the hallways. So this story persists. And the spirit is there. I died in 1806. I was never one to sit around being idle, and I loved to work out in the fields and work with the people whom I had hired. We had a large staff, but I would go out there and work with them and get the hay up and hay piles and so on. But one day in 1806, a very hot day, I suffered heat stroke. Did not realize it. Went back to the house, but did not survive. So I really died at a young age. But my descendants have carried on, and over the years, they have done much for our communities. I did a lot at that time in politics. I was involved in local politics, county politics, state politics, and federal politics. In fact, when I was involved in the New York State Legislature, when the Constitution was being discussed at one of our conventions, I was anti-federalist. Now, in case you don't know what that means, a federalist was somebody who wanted a strong central government. Having fought in the Revolutionary War and coming from England, where sometimes we were not very happy with the king or with King George, I was very concerned about the fact that the United States, or what we call the original colonies, might turn into another kingdom. I did not want that to happen. But I and my other representatives argued long and hard for what we call today states' rights. In our Constitution, it's today known as the Bill of Rights. We felt that there were certain rights that each state, every state should have, and that the federal government would not tell us how to do everything. We would govern ourselves in certain instances. So I felt very proud that I would do that. And then I switched parties. Once that happened, I was no longer an anti-federalist, but I became a federalist. So my history encompassed a whole lot of things for our area. The final heir, Marion Williams, married a popular congressman by the name of James. And James Parker and Marion in the late 1800s and early 1900s ran what we call the Williams Estate, which is now where the Salem Central School is. And the congressman dabbled in horses. He loved to raise good horses for harness racing. That was sort of his hobby. Turns out his hobby took a lot of the Williams money. But that's the way it was. But Marion, of course, gave money to the fire department. The Marion Hose Company was named for her. And she must have had an influence on James, her husband, because after she died, James put in his will that once he died, that the Williams Mansion and the 15-acre estate would be offered to the school district for $8,000, which was a lot of money at that time. But we have to keep in mind that really the school district, the school board, the community was looking for a better way to educate their students. Now James married for a second time, and when he died, the mansion was left empty for 2 years. I think probably we all know what probate is, and it takes a couple of years to work all the way through and the legalities. But at the end of 2 years, his wife then enacted the will, offered the money, not the money, but the school property to the Board of Education, and they held a vote, and they bought the property. And at that time, which was during the Depression, near the end of the Depression, the WPA made an offer to the school district to give them $200,250 toward building a new school, a central school, closing down all the one-room schoolhouses in the area. At the same time, the new centralized school law came about, and so the community held a vote on re-centralizing or reorganizing the school district into one school district, and that passed quite easily. The result is, what you have today is what you see on East Broadway. You pass the school property on your way here. I say the Williams spirit is still there because they love trees and they love flora and fauna. And over the years, I've had people visit our school and say, "What a wonderful piece of property! Why are the tree? The school I went to didn't have any trees on it. We barely had grass." But it's the result of the attitude of the Williams family and their love for all things of nature. And also good school boards who realized that that was important, and when certain trees died, they replanted them. And over the years, we have a lot of trees that are replanted. Most of the original trees are gone. Probably the only original trees left there are the few spruce trees out of back of the school along what used to be a little creek that ran through the property. So there you have it. The Williams family had a great influence on the community. They were important in developing our nation, from military to political to educational to artistic. And so I present to you the Williamses.
Well, hello everybody. My name is not Ms. Audubon. I'm not related to the Audubons. I'm not a reenactor. I'm just a person who loves history. And I'm going to talk about the Audubon family who is buried here. There are 4 of them. Let's see. Caroline is one. That was his daughter-in-law. She was married to his son. She had 2 daughters who are buried here, Maria and
Florence.
Florence, thank you. And a son, Benjamin. And before I talk about the family here, I think I should talk a little bit about John James Audubon, because he was a very famous person. Everybody knows who he was, but maybe not all that we need to know about him. Of course, he was a birder. He wrote a book called Birds of Northeast America, which became the primary book for studying birds. And he was born in Santo Domingo, which is now Haiti, in what date? 1751, something like that. His father was a sailor in the French Royal Navy. His mother was a person of indeterminate parentage and genealogy. We don't know who she was. But at the age of 9, his father decided to take him back home to England, where he was adopted by his father's wife. And he grew up in England in a very nurturing and loving family. At the age of 18, his father decided to send him over to America to manage a lead mine, a general store, and some other businesses that he had over in the new country, in the new world. John James was not a businessman. The only thing he wanted to do was draw birds. He was very good at it. And he traveled all around the United States looking for birds to draw. His way of drawing these birds was first to shoot them, unfortunately. But back then we didn't have cameras, to say nothing of high digital lenses or anything of that sort. So he did a very good job cataloging birds and their habitat. Not only did he draw the birds, he would draw the branch that the bird fell off after he shot them. So we know a lot about what the bird's habitat and habits were like. As I said, he was not a good businessman. So he was financially unsuccessful. And at one point, the sheriff came to his place of business and took all of his assets to pay for his debts. It wasn't enough, and John James wound up in debtor's prison. Now here's a little sidebar to this story. If you want to know more about debtor's prison, check out the site of Shays Rebellion, which is over in Sandgate. There was a fellow called Mr. Shay who refused to obey the laws of the United States, which were to not get paid for being a soldier in the Revolutionary War. That's a whole different story. It's very interesting. And I'm leading up to a point here. And the other thing about debtor's prison, I didn't know this until I was doing a little research into Shays Rebellion. We had this president. His name was Millard Fillmore. Does anybody remember Millard Fillmore and what he did? He abolished debtor's prison. So when you're talking about what the presidents of the United States did, and somebody says, well, what did Millard Fillmore do? Who was he? He abolished debtor's prison. But it was too late for John James. He spent some time in debtor's prison. And understandably, he didn't have a whole lot of money, in spite of the fact that he became famous as an ornithologist. He didn't have a whole lot of money to send down to his descendants. So his granddaughters, Maria and Florence, and his mother, Caroline, were forced to go to work. Maria got a job down in New York City, quite a famous school down there, a very well-known private school. So she taught down there and became assistant headmistress. The headmistress of that school down there liked to get away from New York City in the summertime, and she knew of a really nice place up here in the Northeast that had some nice little tourist homes. It was called Salem. So she would come up here to Salem for her summers, and she would invite the Audubon girls to come up here too. and she bought a house over on East Broadway, which came to be known as the Audubon House, because when she died in whatever it was, I forget the date, she willed this house over to the Audubon family. So after she died, the girls came up here to live. They actually lived in this house on East Broadway. And not only did they just live there, but they became benefactors of the community. They became full-time residents, beloved of the community. They had a lot of their father's things, some mementos that he had, a lot of his paintings, and they very generously donated these to the library in Salem, the school in Salem. Very much became a part of the community here in Salem. There was talk about Benjamin over here. I think this is Benjamin here, right? Benjamin was only 30 years old when he died. He died of TB. So after they lived their lives out in Salem, this is where they wound up, here in the cemetery at Evergreen. It seemed to be a perfectly normal place for them to want to be, even though their famous grandfather is buried down in New York City along with some members of his family. He is buried in Trinity Church, and if you know anything about Trinity Church, it's well, it looks like a little bitty church, a little stone church down there on the south end of Manhattan. And I remember on that famous day in 9/11, a few years ago, when the towers came down, monster towers crashing down to the ground. Here's this church, little dinky thing, but it's a stone church. It survived. It's still there, beautiful church, and that's where John James Audubon is buried, along with some other members of his family. But his family wound up here in Evergreen Cemetery. And if you need to know anything else about the family, they're very available on the internet, and it actually mentions where they are buried right up here in Evergreen. So we have a famous little plot here for a very famous family. Now, I wanted to know a little bit more about the Audubon girls, as far as what their reactions and their lifestyle was like in Salem. What did they do? How did they get along with their neighbors? So, I found this book. Now, Al, a few minutes ago, he was talking about, Al, speaking as General Williams, mentioned that the spirit of General Williams is still inherent around this area. I myself have not seen General Williams. I have heard him. I haven't seen him. But I wanted to look in this book. This is the book that Harriet Williams wrote about Salem. And I was hoping I'd find something in this book. It's called the Salem Book. I found nothing in here about the Audubon family except the very top here. Maria Audubon is listed on the historical committee as far as contributing to this book. So that leads me to think that she was an important person in the community. She contributed to the community. She loved it and probably knew a lot about it, but totally modest as far as who she was and who her famous family was. So that's about all I've got to say.
Very good.
Thank you.
I am going to talk to you today about Asa Fitch Jr. I'm Judy Flagg. I'm the town historian for Salem, and we didn't have a reenactor to do Asa, so I would just like to tell you some of the important things that he did and why he has this large, handsome obelisk here in this cemetery. He was born in Salem of Asa Fitch Sr. No, he wasn't. He was born in Massachusetts in 1809. The family came here and established a large estate at what is known now as Fitch's Point, which is just to the southwest of the village of Salem. There is a historic marker there on Route 29, which you will see. It talks about his life as an entomologist for New York State. When the Fitches first came here, they had several children. The oldest son was Martin Fitch, and he was educated at Middlebury College. He was a very bright young man, and he brought much honor to the family. But shortly after his graduation at Middlebury, he died. We don't know what it was he died of, but he died very early. At that point, his father decided that he wasn't educating any more of his children. That's it. He'd spent all this money educating Martin, and he had died. So the next son, Asa, was not supposed to be going on to school. He was going to be a farmer and live on the land and live at the estate and raise sheep and other crops. But when he became 12 years old, he became very sickly. He caught a disease. I don't know what it was. We just don't know at the time what it would have been. But they thought he was going to die. For a week, it was touch and go, and they didn't know if he was going to live from one day to the next. At the end of that time, he was left very weak and feeble and was bedridden for a long period of time. At that time, he took up the hobby of collecting bugs. Insects and flowers really interested him, and he took copious notes in personal diaries. He would draw pictures of the insects, he'd draw pictures of the flowers, and write his observations, study about them in books, and it became a lifelong passion for him. His father decided, because he was so weak, that he couldn't carry on as a farmer. So he decided, okay, we'll send him on to college. So they sent him to Rensselaer School, which is now RPI, and he graduated from there in 1838. At that time, too, he also went on to become a doctor like his father. He went to Rutgers University in New York City and became a physician. After his graduation from Rutgers, he settled in the area of Stillwater, New York, to take up practice there. And he also met a young lady by the name of Elizabeth McNeil, who would become his wife. And at that time, they moved their family to Fort Miller, and he became a physician at the Fort Miller area for several years. At the end of the 1830s, his father became very ill, and he could no longer maintain the estate here at Fitch's Point. At that point, Asa Jr. came back to Salem and took over the estate here at Fitch's Point and became a farmer and helped out his father and his family until his father's death. And then Asa continued to stay there, again, collecting all kinds of insects, cataloging, writing copious notes about the insects he collected. And he traveled the entire area of Washington County. And in so doing, when he would go to these other areas, he would talk to the individuals there about their lives, about their ancestors' lives, about the countries that they came from. And he would write all of these notes longhand and keep all of these studies about the families, also about their reminiscences of the Revolutionary War, just prior to the war and after the war. He took thousands and thousands of notes. His idea was to one day put this all into a history of Washington County. Unfortunately, he died before that ever happened, but we did still have his notes. Then in 1854, his hobby became his vocation, because he was named the first New York State entomologist. That was a position that was never created before in New York State. He was the very first one, and he held that position for 17 years. And in that position, and with all of the notes and the studies that he had done, he gained worldwide fame. Accolades were laid upon him in England and in France. He really was a worldwide important figure. He was also the first president of the Cemetery Association when Evergreen Cemetery was being created, and when the concept came to them that the burying ground that we were in this morning was filled. They needed a new place to lay their dead. And this area was bought, these acres were bought, and he was the one who was instrumental in getting J.C. Sidney, who was a landscape designer out of Philadelphia, who came and laid out the roadways, the grounds, there were actually 2 ponds at that time. There was one over behind the superintendent's house, which is still there, and there was another one down in this low area behind us. That one has since been filled in. But that was an important mission that he had. And the Cemetery Association carried on until his death. He still was the president, and that was in 1879. So he lived to be age 70. And later on in the 1800s, the community was so taken with his importance and how much of a figure he was in the area, they took up a collection and raised a lot of money in those days and had this monument created with his likeness here at the obelisk. And also all of these stones were bought at the same time. They're all identical stones for all of the Fitch family members. So this is the whole Fitch family plot. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, again, welcome. We are actually standing in front of 2 Civil War monuments. The first larger monument on the hill is dedicated to all the soldiers and sailors who fought in the Civil War. Primarily it does not say 123rd Regiment. That was the county regiment. But when they put the statue up, they wanted it to include all soldiers and all sailors. That was the point of it. The 123rd was organized in Salem in 1862 when President Lincoln put out a request that we needed more volunteers. So the people would come to Salem to volunteer. The men might have even indicated that they wanted to join up in Hartford at the recruitment station there, but then they had to come to Salem to get their uniforms and to join the camp known as Camp Washington, which was in back of the railroad tracks. The 123rd, probably their best and well-known victorious battle was Gettysburg. They were also at the Battle of Fredericksburg, which was awful. They just got wiped out. But the 123rd was at Gettysburg and does have a wonderful monument dedicated to the 123rd there. In fact, the monument's nose and stylus was just fixed. And Judy, do you want to just say a few words about that?
Yes, this was a year ago. We were in Gettysburg as the stone carver was there recreating Cleo's nose. She was missing half of her nose, and her nose was good size. I mean, she's got a nose like this. So you noticed that she was missing half of it. And also she's depicted taking notes on a pad, and she's writing for history what has happened there at Gettysburg so that we do not forget the importance of that battle. And someone over the years had gotten up on top of the statue and broken off her stylus. So she's writing, but she had no implement in her hand. So the stone carver was able to reproduce both the stylus and her nose. So she's back as one beautiful girl once again, and she's one of the most beautiful monuments in Gettysburg. If you do get down there, you do need to stop and see Cleo.
Right, by the way, the only woman monument in Gettysburg. All the others depict soldiers, in battle or at rest or whatever. The monument directly in back of us is that of General David Allen Russell. An interesting story about David Allen Russell. He went to Salem, Washington Academy, and then was commissioned to go to West Point, which he did. Graduated in 1850. In 1850, he then went west to fight in the Indian Wars and the Mexican Wars. And it was while he was out west that he met a guy by the name of Phil Sheridan, who was also a graduate of West Point. They became good friends. The Civil War broke out and they decided to fight with the Union. Both of them, as you know, you probably know General Sheridan more than Allen, but Allen was known as a soldier's soldier. He did not fight from the rear. He did not stand on the hill and watch the battle in front of him. He felt that he had to be in the front lines and mixed in with his men. That was his attitude. That was his tact. And he developed his own tactics, especially when he was fighting in the Indian Wars and in the Mexican War. By the end of the war, he was in what's known as the 6th Regiment, and his uncle, Solomon Russell, also from Salem, joined him in the, sorry, misspoke, not the regiment, the 6th Corps, as one of his adjutants. It was at the Battle of Winchester, where Philip Sheridan and his cavalry were engaging the enemy. But David Allen Russell was wounded twice during the battles that were taking place. And during the 3rd battle, when Philip Sheridan happened to be away with the cavalry, the lines began to fail. And if you know anything about Civil War battles, you know it's a battle of a bunch of men on one side and a bunch of men on the other side shooting at each other, and when they thought it was appropriate, they would attack and try to overrun the enemy's lines. And on this day, the United States soldiers were getting clobbered. But David Allen Russell took it upon himself to get on his horse and to go out in the front of the troops and urge them back into battle. And they did follow him, but in the process, he was again wounded 2 more times and killed in battle. This monument, of course, is his. For his bravery, he was awarded the rank of general, commonly known as a breveted general. A breveted officer was a title given to someone who had died in battle. So it was a posthumously awarded rank for him. But he is today known as General David Allen Russell. He was not forgotten. There was a fort named for him in the West. People out there remembered him for his Indian wars, Mexican wars. And on the coast of California, there was a battery of cannon named the Russell Battery. And that was named for General David Allen Russell. Interesting thing about that particular battery is that the cannon were made at the Watervliet Arsenal. And during World War II, the Japanese submarine came in close enough to fire a couple of shots at this battery, but did no harm whatsoever. The cannon did not respond, keeping in mind these were very old cannon, not very accurate, so they didn't bother to respond. There is a museum for him. All his papers are at William and Mary in their historic collection today. So he was a significant person. There is a book written about him by called That Splendid Soldier, but it gives you a whole story of his graduating from West Point up right through his death in the Civil War. The other unique thing about going to West Point is that Salem, ever since General John Williams, Salem men have participated, and women have participated in it seems like all the wars or engagements that we have had. A number of them going to West Point, some to the Coast Guard Academy. I think within the last 4 or 5 years we've had 2 West Pointers, a Coast Guard Academy, 2 Coast Guard Academy people now that I think about it. So we have a tradition in Salem of men and women coming to the forefront to help defend our country and our freedom. And we owe that to the men of the 123rd and to General David Allen Russell, and of course, General John Williams. So, thank you.
You're standing in front of the very humble stones of my mom and dad. At the time my mom died in 1960, the family income was $1,500 a year on our little dairy farm where we milked 24 head. Just so you know that, you can tell that to Jim. So not a lot of people think I have a dairy background, but I do, and I'm supportive of a lot of agriculture in our very beautiful county. I'd like to thank both Al and Judy for their work personally and their team or teams. I think this is a great idea, and I hope it can continue because there are just hundreds of stories here that are lost to most of us because some of the family names we haven't even heard. I'm here because my dad was awarded the Medal of Honor for his valor in World War II. And this will get to me because it's a very tender story as it goes along. The Medal of Honors in World War II, I'll just give you some basic facts. There were 473 awarded. There were 13 million soldiers. 294 of these were in the Army, as was my dad, 38 the Army Air Corps, 57 in the Navy, and 83 in the Marines. And my dad always said that the heroes died on the battlefield. And I think that's true for a lot of soldiers. My dad never spoke about his valor in any sense that was prideful. He was the mayor of our town, the supervisor of our town. He was on the town board. He led many a parade. He carried the color guard proudly. He always looked straight ahead. He was always a proud soldier and a good man. And I'm going to read you his citation. You'll also find a very handsome monument to my dad at the library downtown, right in front of the Proudfoot Hall portion of the library. Beautifully done, beautifully placed there by the American Legion in the town, and I'm thankful for that. And persons have thought it might be able to be placed in different spots, but that's where my dad walked through the door to go to American Legion meetings. So for him and his soldier companions, that's precisely where it belongs. His citation. He fought gallantly in Luxembourg and Germany. On 12 September 1944, Company K began fording the Our River near Calborn, Luxembourg, to take high ground on the opposite bank. Covered by early morning fog, the 3rd Platoon, in which Sergeant Clark was squad leader, successfully negotiated the crossing. But when the 2nd Platoon reached the shore, withering automatic and small arms fire ripped into it, eliminating the platoon leader and platoon sergeant and pinning the troops in the open. From his comparatively safe position, Sergeant Clark crawled alone across a field, a hail of bullets to the stricken troops. He led the platoon to safety and then, unhesitatingly, returned to the fire-swept area to rescue a wounded soldier, carrying him to the American line while hostile gunners tried to cut him down. Later, he led his squad and men of the 2nd Platoon in a dangerous sortie against strong enemy positions to weaken them by lightning-like jabs. He assaulted an enemy machine gun with hand grenades, killing 2 Germans. He roamed the front and flanks, dashing toward hostile weapons, killing and wounding an undetermined number of the enemy, scattering German patrols, and eventually forcing the withdrawal of a full company of Germans, heavily armed with automatic weapons. On 17 September, near Svenig, Germany, he advanced alone against an enemy machine gun, killed the gunner, and forced the assistant to flee. The Germans counterattacked, and heavy casualties were suffered by Company K. Seeing that 2 platoons lacked the leadership, Sergeant Clark took over their command and moved among the men to give encouragement. Although wounded on the morning of 18 September, he refused to be evacuated and took up a position in a pillbox when night came. Emerging at daybreak, he killed a German soldier, setting up a machine gun not more than 5 yards away. When he located another enemy gun, he moved up unobserved and killed 2 Germans with rifle fire. Later that day, he voluntarily braved small arms fire to take food and water to members of an isolated platoon. Sergeant Clark's actions in assuming command when leadership was desperately needed, in launching attacks and beating off counterattacks, in aiding his stranded comrades, and in fearlessly facing powerful enemy fire, were strikingly heroic examples and put fighting heart into the hard-pressed men of Company K. Great guy. Great soldier, good man, humble, kind, funny, and in a loving marriage to my mother, who died at 1960 at 40, after 17 years of marriage. That was another dramatic time for my dad. And I did some research this morning, and in a study or an analysis of 55 million soldiers from 19 veterans from 1979 to 2014, it was found that approximately 20 veterans a day commit suicide. And whew, here lies one of them. My dad took his life on October of 1981. And all I ask of you is that you be aware that the soldiers around you, some you don't even know, some who seem to be in a wonderful place, in a wonderful state of mind, and pray God, almost all of them are, pray God one day all of them will be. But behind those eyes, there may be a very troubled person. So as Bette Midler's song says, say hello in there. Hello. Thank you.
Just a little background as to how we got to this point with the Stewarts. One day I got an email, and it's from Lloyd saying, I'm looking for these people. I don't know where they are buried. I think they're buried in Washington County. And I said, give me the names. So he sent me the names, and I looked at them and I said, I think they're buried here. So he came up to visit with me, and we toured the African grounds, and we toured the Revolutionary War Cemetery. And he said, yep, Van Branken's, the Burks, said, those are mine. Sadly, over the years, this whole area, which is the African grounds, the poor lot, and what we would call the traveler's lot, have been sort of neglected. In Victorian times, some of these things, as you can tell now, were outside of the cemetery proper. That was the thinking back then. We don't think that way anymore, fortunately. But we looked at this, and Lloyd brought in some ground penetrating equipment, hired a crew to come in to see if we could find any more graves in this area. Unfortunately, we did not, but we found 2 stones that were buried in the ground, and those were taken up and reset, and you'll see them if you want to walk down there, that there are 2 gravestones that we did find. Unfortunately, over the years, in cemeteries, sometimes if a stone gets broken, and it happens not only here, but up here, whoever's mowing the lawn says, what do I want this for? And it goes over the bank. So stones have been lost. We saw the same thing in the Revolutionary War Cemetery. But from this, Lloyd felt that he wanted to do a genealogy study on his family. So he took the information that he found here and has written 2 books, which he had hoped to bring with him. And when he got out of the car this morning, he said, I forgot the books. Oh. So we were hoping that we would have some books that people could purchase from him. At any rate, the great books, all you have to do is get on the internet, type in L. Lloyd Stewart, and his works will come up. It was a revelation for me to work with Lloyd, because even as historian, I did not know much about this cemetery at all. And again, the sad part is, as happens in cemeteries, whoever is in charge, they either do a good job or they do a terrible job. So cemetery records are not as complete as we would like them to be. Case in point, my own son is looking for a lot here in the cemetery, and the person in charge is saying, well, we've got some empty space, but we don't know if anybody's buried there. Because there are no tombstones, and the records aren't that great. So now they got to go around with, the rod system. You punch a rod in the ground to see what you could find. But that's typical, not only of old cemeteries, but even today. We hear horror stories about cemeteries that have been neglected and weird things are done. But over the years, they have tried to maintain it somewhat. A new sign here pointing out the grounds. Ken Flagg, Judy's husband, did a new sign because when Judy tried to straighten it up, it fell apart in her hands. So Ken made up a whole new sign for the cemetery. But the road down through, I'd rather we not drive. It's a difficult path to get down in there. But if you want to walk down there, fine, that's okay. Our next stop is going to be Peter Carolyn, and Peter is talking about
Old Head Allen.
Old Head Allen, a very interesting story about cadavers, autopsies, a few other things. So,
my name is Dr. Abram Allen. I am the eminent surgeon of Salem, New York. I moved here from Sturbridge, Mass. in 1765. I came with my brother Ephraim. We set up an office down on Broadway in Salem, across from the livery stable and the new white church. Some of the local history. In 1799, the Pinckney Treaty was signed, which was our southern border, this country's southern border. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase was made, which set up our western border. In 1803 also, Salem became an incorporated village. Let's see. The basics of my story start July 31st, 1802. There was a gentleman felling trees in a pasture just east of the village. His name was Isaac Gray. One of the trees came down and a branch winged him. It caught him on the side of the head. Isaac was knocked unconscious and was soon delivered to his home. The doctor was summoned from Rupert, a Dr. Samuel Adams. He came down and visited Isaac and took care of him for 10 days. Isaac showed no improvement. I was called at the 10th day with John Williams, Dr. General John Williams, for consultation. John and I traveled by wagon up to Rupert and visited Isaac. Upon my initial examination, I found that Isaac had a swelling on the back of his head and would need a procedure called trepanning. Now this is a procedure where they drill a small hole in the back of the cranium and release whatever pressure is there and whatever material is there. We consulted with Mrs. Gray, Martha, Isaac's wife, about this procedure. She agreed as long as John did the procedure. So John Williams did the operation that afternoon, and of course I supervised. The next morning we came back to Isaac's home. We found Isaac sitting up in bed, talking and eating breakfast. We thought that was a pretty good improvement over flat on his back unconscious. We redressed the incision and prepared to come back the next day. The second day we returned, Isaac was much the same. He was sitting up, was talking with his wife, he was eating breakfast. On the third day, when we returned to Rupert, Isaac was unconscious and we could not rouse him. Once again, I examined Isaac and found that he had a swelling on his head and would require a second trepanning procedure. Martha decided not to allow us to do this. Subsequently, Isaac died on the 31st of July, and we buried him the next afternoon on the 1st. I knew I was right. I knew I had it right. I had to prove it. So, under cover of darkness that evening, my male colored servant and I went to the burying grounds. Now, my male servant's name was Koofy. Now, Koofy rode in the wagon with me up to the burying grounds. We had a shovel and my bag, and we went to the grave and picked up started to dig the hole. Of course, I had Koofy digging. Now, Koofy would dig everything except for the last foot. He was really superstitious. He figured that Isaac was going to jump up and get him. So I dug the last foot and Koofy hid behind a tree. When I got to the coffin, we opened it up and I removed Isaac's head and returned to the office. At that time, I met with Dr. Alexander McAllister and Dr. Williams and numerous other friends, and we did a post-mortem on Isaac's head. We removed the scalp, opened the skull, and found that there was a large mass on the opposite side of where we had done the first hole. It proved that had I drilled a second hole, that man would have been alive today. So, that's the basics of the story. After we discovered this, we returned Isaac to the cemetery. Kofi and I rode back in the wagon and returned him to his gravesite and reburied Isaac. As is true in Salem today and then, one of the local busybodies saw me in the graveyard. And the village folks lined the streets of Salem for my return. They both cheered and jeered me on my way back to the office. August 2nd, the local sheriff had been notified and I was promptly arrested. A few days later, there was a trial. I was put before the judge where I very proudly professed that yes, I had dug up Isaac Gray, and yes, I had removed his head, and yes, I had proven that a second trepanning would have saved his life. The judge wasn't really amused. He charged me $250. That was the fine. At that point, I gladly paid. It was the best advertising dollar I had ever spent. You may laugh. I became one of the richest doctors in Salem. At that point, there were 4 doctors here and 1 in Rupert, 1 in Shushan. I got patients from all over the county. They would come just to have me work on them. It made me a very, very, very rich man. And that is why Abram Allen is the preeminent physician in Salem, New York. Okay, now this is written in the local history and the Washington County History book. Judy Flagg and Al Cormier helped me with the research, also Google. Every name you heard, every date you heard is in that 12-paragraph piece. The only name that's made up is Kofi. At that point, he was just a footnote. Colored folks in America weren't thought of highly. But I thought he needed a more prominent position, so I gave him a name and a little bit of a personality. Let's see. I guess your next step is the creamery. We'd like to thank you all for coming today. Oh, 2 more things. I forgot, Judy just reminded me. John Clark, who's standing in the back here, and Michelle Hunter Bardwell and her husband recently rediscovered the Abram Allen stones. Abram and his wife and 3 of his children, Ephraim and his wife and 3 of his children are buried just over the crest of the hill. The eminent physician part, it's on the stone. I figure he probably had an ego when I wrote the part. So feel free to check him out. He's back there.